The moment the police cruiser rolled into the quiet cul-de-sac, I already knew two things. First, someone had made a very serious accusation. And second, the person who made it had absolutely no idea who I was. I was standing beside my truck, unloading groceries after a long day at the courthouse. The evening air was calm, the neighborhood peaceful, until the sharp voice of Karen Mitchell cut through the street like a siren. "There he is, officer," she shouted dramatically, pointing directly at me. The two officers stepped out of the cruiser, exchanging a quick glance before walking toward my driveway. Behind them, Karen stood with her arms crossed, wearing the smug smile of someone who believed she had just won. Now, Karen had been a problem in our HOA for months. Complaints about trash cans, lawn height, mailbox colors, you name it, she had reported it. But today, apparently, she decided to go bigger. Much bigger. One officer approached politely. "Sir, we received a report that you've been illegally operating a business from your home and forging official documents." I almost laughed. Forging documents, operating an illegal business. Those accusations weren't just ridiculous, they were dangerous. Karen stepped closer, eager to add her own dramatic narration. "I've seen suspicious people coming and going all week," she insisted loudly. "And he's always carrying briefcases full of papers. I'm certain he's running some kind of fraud operation." The officers looked back at me, waiting for my explanation. I calmly set my grocery bag on the hood of the truck. "You're welcome to take a look inside the briefcase," I said. Karen leaned forward triumphantly. "See, he's nervous. Criminals always pretend to cooperate." The younger officer opened the case. Inside were neatly organized legal files, stamped documents, and a black judicial robe folded carefully at the bottom. The officer paused. His eyebrows lifted slowly. Karen's smug expression froze. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "these are court files." "Yes," I replied calmly. Karen scoffed loudly. "Exactly. That's what I've been saying. He's forging them." The officer looked at her, then back at me. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "these documents belong to the county court system." Karen blinked. "What?" The officer turned fully toward me now. "Sir, are you affiliated with the court?" I picked up the folded robe from the briefcase and draped it over my arm. "You could say that." Karen's confidence started cracking. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "do you realize the seriousness of filing a false police report?" Karen's face turned pale, but what she didn't know yet was that her lie wasn't just about to fail. It was about to launch a full police investigation. And by the time she discovered who I really was, it would already be too late. Karen Mitchell had always been the loudest voice in the neighborhood, but in that moment, standing in my driveway with two police officers watching her carefully, the confidence that usually fueled her complaints began to flicker. For a brief second, it looked like she might step back and admit she had made a mistake. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat. Instead, she doubled down. "Well, obviously those files are fake," she said quickly, waving her hand dismissively. "Anyone can print documents and wear a costume. That doesn't prove anything." The younger officer blinked slowly. "A costume," he repeated. Karen nodded with complete certainty. "Yes, I've watched enough crime shows to know how these scams work." I couldn't help but smile slightly at that. The older officer shifted his stance and looked at me again. "Sir," he said calmly, "would you mind explaining what you do for a living?" Before I could answer, Karen interrupted again. "Oh, please," she scoffed loudly. "He's about to spin some ridiculous story." I closed the briefcase and picked it up. "My name is Daniel Harper," I said evenly. "And I've been a county judge for 12 years. Silence fell over the driveway. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "That's impossible," she snapped. The younger officer looked down at the nameplate on one of the court folders. His eyes widened slightly. "Judge Harper," he murmured. Karen stepped forward again, refusing to accept what was happening. "No," she said firmly. "He's lying. I've lived here for 3 years and I've never seen him go to court." "That's probably because my court starts at 7 in the morning," I replied calmly. The older officer was now studying Karen very carefully. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you claimed this man was forging legal documents and running a criminal operation." Karen crossed her arms defensively. "Yes, because I'm protecting the neighborhood. But if he is actually a judge, the officer continued, that accusation becomes extremely serious. Karen waved her hand dismissively again. Well then prove it. The younger officer pulled out his radio. Dispatch, he said, pressing the button, can you confirm the employment of a Daniel Harper with the county court system? Karen watched him with complete confidence. She clearly believed she was about to be proven right. A few seconds passed. Static crackled through the radio. Then the dispatcher's voice came through. Affirmative. Judge Daniel Harper, Superior Court, 12 years of service. Karen's smile vanished instantly. The officer slowly lowered the radio. Well, he said quietly. Karen stared at me, then at the officers, then back at me again. This is ridiculous, she whispered. But the situation was already shifting in a direction she never expected. Because now the officers weren't investigating me anymore. They were starting to investigate her. And Karen had no idea how much trouble she had just created for herself. The moment the dispatcher confirmed my position, the entire atmosphere in the driveway changed. Just minutes earlier, Karen had been standing there like a victorious prosecutor, convinced she had exposed a criminal operation in the neighborhood. Now she stood frozen, her confidence draining away with every passing second. The two officers exchanged a quiet glance. Their attention had shifted completely. And Karen was beginning to realize it. Well, that still doesn't explain the suspicious activity, she said quickly, trying to recover control of the situation. The older officer folded his arms. What suspicious activity, ma'am? Karen pointed toward my house. People come here all the time carrying files and folders. They stay for a while, then leave looking upset. That's not normal. I couldn't help but chuckle softly. The younger officer looked confused. Ma'am, that sounds like legal consultations. Karen's face tightened. Exactly, she said. That's what criminals do when they're planning something. The officer raised an eyebrow. Or, he replied calmly, that's what lawyers do when they meet with a judge regarding case reviews. Karen's jaw tightened again. But I saw envelopes, she insisted. Thick ones. Yes, I said calmly. Case filings. And people argue in the driveway sometimes. Yes, I replied. Attorneys disagreeing about motions. Karen's entire argument was collapsing piece by piece. But instead of backing down, she leaned even further into it. Well, maybe he's taking bribes, she blurted. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The officers went completely still. Accusing a judge of bribery wasn't just gossip anymore. That was a criminal allegation. The older officer's expression hardened. Ma'am, he said slowly, are you stating that you have evidence this judge has accepted bribes? Karen hesitated. Just for a moment. Then she nodded. Yes, I believe he has. The younger officer glanced at his partner again. All right, the older officer said carefully. Then we're going to need details. Karen blinked. Details. Yes, he continued. Dates, witnesses, proof, anything that supports that accusation. Karen's confidence started cracking again. Well, I mean, I haven't seen the money directly. The officer's tone remained calm but firm. So you have no physical evidence? Well, no. Any witnesses? Karen shook her head slightly. No. Any recordings, photos, documents? No. The officer let out a slow breath. The younger officer was now writing something down in a small notebook. Karen noticed it immediately. What are you writing? She asked nervously. Documenting the report, he replied. But I'm the one who called you, Karen said quickly. Yes, the officer said calmly. And right now we're documenting exactly what was reported. Karen looked suddenly uncomfortable, because for the first time, she realized something important. This wasn't a neighborhood argument anymore. Everything she had just said was now officially recorded, and the investigation she thought would destroy me was slowly starting to turn directly toward her. Karen was beginning to sweat. Not the dramatic kind she usually performed for HOA meetings, but the real kind. The kind that comes when someone suddenly realizes they may have pushed a situation too far. The officers continued writing notes while Karen shifted nervously in place. I think you're misunderstanding me, she said quickly. I'm just reporting suspicious activity. That's what responsible neighbors do. The older officer nodded slowly. And we appreciate citizens reporting concerns, he replied calmly. Karen sighed with relief. For a moment, she thought the pressure had eased. Then the officer continued. However, making criminal accusations against someone, especially a public official, requires evidence. Karen's shoulders stiffened again. Before she could respond, another car pulled up along the curb. A gray sedan. The driver stepped out quickly, clearly confused by the police cars parked on the quiet street. It was Mark Jensen, the HOA president. Karen's eyes lit up instantly. "Mark," she called out loudly. Perfect timing. Mark walked over cautiously, glancing between Karen, the officers, and me. "What's going on?" he asked. Karen pointed dramatically at me again. "I finally caught him," she said proudly. "I told you something illegal was happening at this house." Mark looked confused. "Caught him doing what?" "He's running some kind of fraud operation," Karen insisted. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Actually, ma'am," he said gently, "Mr. Harper is a county judge." Mark blinked. "What?" Karen waved her hand dismissively. "That's what he claims." Mark turned toward me slowly. "Judge Harper." I nodded politely. Mark's face suddenly changed. The confusion vanished, replaced with recognition. Oh wow," he said quietly. "You're that Judge Harper." Karen stared at him. "What do you mean that Judge Harper?" Mark rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "Karen, he handled the zoning dispute case last year." Karen frowned. So, Mark continued slowly, "that case involved our HOA." Karen's expression froze. The officers stopped writing and looked up. "You mean," the younger officer asked, "this judge has already ruled on matters involving this HOA?" Mark nodded. "Yes, multiple times actually." Karen looked between all of us, suddenly realizing the situation was getting worse. Much worse. Because now the officers weren't just dealing with a random accusation. They were looking at a resident who had called the police on a judge, who had previously handled legal disputes involving her own HOA. The older officer looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "were you aware of Judge Harper's position before making these accusations?" Karen hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward Mark. Then back to the officers. "Well, maybe," she muttered. The officers exchanged another glance. Because that answer raised a very different question. One that could turn Karen's false report into something far more serious. The older officer closed his notebook slowly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we're going to need to ask you a few more questions." And Karen suddenly looked like she wished she had never picked up the phone that day. Karen's confidence had completely evaporated. Just 20 minutes earlier, she had stood in the middle of the street pointing at me like a triumphant detective exposing a criminal mastermind. Now she looked like someone realizing the ground beneath her feet was starting to crumble. The older officer closed his notebook and turned toward her. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we're going to clarify a few things about the report you made." Karen tried to straighten her posture. "I already told you everything," she said defensively. "Not exactly," the officer replied. He glanced at his partner. "Dispatch recorded the call as a report of an illegal fraud operation involving forged legal documents." Karen nodded quickly. "Yes, because that's what I believed. But you've now acknowledged," the officer continued, "that you knew Mr. Harper might be a judge." Karen's eyes widened. "Well, I mean, I wasn't completely sure." The younger officer spoke up. "So you suspected he was a judge, and still reported him for forging court documents?" Karen opened her mouth. No words came out. Mark Jensen, the HOA president, slowly rubbed his temples. "Karen," he muttered under his breath. But Karen wasn't ready to give up yet. "You're twisting my words," she snapped. "I'm just trying to keep this neighborhood safe." The older officer remained calm. "And we appreciate that," he said. "But making a false report can be a crime." Karen's face tightened again. "It wasn't false," she insisted. The officer nodded slightly. "Then we'll need evidence." Karen looked around desperately. Her eyes landed on my house. "There," she said suddenly. "People come here all the time with legal files. That's suspicious." The younger officer looked at her carefully. "Ma'am, judges review legal files." Karen hesitated again. "Well, they shouldn't do it at home." I finally spoke again. "Judges regularly review case documents outside the courthouse," I said calmly. "It's part of the job." The officers both nodded. Mark sighed heavily. Karen's shoulders dropped slightly. But the older officer wasn't finished. "There's another issue," he said. Karen looked up nervously. "What?" The officer flipped a page in his notebook. "During the call, you also claimed Mr. Harper was accepting bribes." Karen froze. I didn't mean it like that. "But you did say it," the officer replied. The younger officer continued writing. "And that allegation triggered an automatic report review." Karen's stomach seemed to drop. "Review?" "Yes," the officer said calmly. "Any accusation of corruption involving a judge must be formally documented." Karen looked like she might faint. Because what she thought was just neighborhood drama had now turned into something official. Something recorded. Something that could be reviewed by people far above the local police department. Mark slowly shook his head. "Karen, what were you thinking?" Karen didn't answer. Because deep down, she was starting to understand something terrifying. This situation was no longer under her control, and the investigation she thought would expose a criminal was now building a case against the person who started it. Her. Karen's breathing had become noticeably uneven. Moments earlier, she had been loudly accusing me of running a criminal operation. Now she looked like someone desperately searching for a way out of a situation she no longer understood. "I think this whole thing is getting blown out of proportion," she said suddenly. The older officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, you reported multiple serious crimes." Karen shook her head quickly. No, I just meant something seemed suspicious. That's all. I never meant to start an investigation." The younger officer glanced down at his notes. "Well, according to the recorded call, you specifically said the suspect was forging court documents and accepting bribes." Karen's face turned red. "Well, maybe I exaggerated a little." Mark Jensen, the HOA president, let out a quiet groan. "A little," he muttered. Karen ignored him. She pointed at me again, though the gesture was much weaker now. "He still shouldn't be reviewing cases at home," she insisted. The officer shook his head slightly. "That's not illegal." Karen looked around the street nervously. Several neighbors had stepped outside by now, quietly watching from their driveways. Whispers were starting to spread. Karen noticed, and she hated being watched. "Look," she said quickly, "can we just forget this whole thing?" The officers didn't respond right away. Instead, the older officer spoke slowly. "Ma'am, once a report like this is filed, we can't simply erase it." Karen's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "It means the report exists in the system," the officer explained. "And because the accusation involved a judge, it's automatically reviewed by internal oversight." Karen looked like she had just heard a language she didn't understand. "Internal? What?" "Judicial oversight," the younger officer clarified. Karen's shoulders slumped. "But I said I didn't mean it," she whispered. "That doesn't change the report," the officer replied. Mark shook his head again. "Karen, you can't just accuse someone of corruption and expect it to disappear." Karen's eyes suddenly darted toward the sidewalk. Then toward her house. She took a small step backward. The older officer noticed immediately. "Ma'am, please stay here." Karen forced a nervous laugh. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. I think I left something inside." The officer shook his head. "We still have a few questions." Karen swallowed. Because the reality was finally sinking in. This wasn't a neighborhood complaint anymore. It wasn't even just a police matter. Her accusations had triggered official documentation involving the court system. And there was no undo button for that. Karen looked at me one last time. Her voice was quieter now. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." I met her gaze calmly. "By accusing a judge of bribery." Karen looked away. The officers exchanged another glance. Because at this point, the situation had reached a stage where they needed to decide what happened next. And that decision was not going to make Karen very happy. The quiet street had turned into a small audience. Neighbors stood on their porches, some pretending to water plants while clearly watching every second of the unfolding drama. Others whispered across driveways, trying to piece together what had happened. Karen noticed all of them. And for someone who thrived on neighborhood attention, this was the worst kind. Because this time, the spotlight wasn't working in her favor. The older officer stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we need to clarify one final thing." Karen looked exhausted now. "What? Did you knowingly make a false report?" "Karen," shook her head immediately. No. The officer nodded slowly. Then you're stating that you genuinely believed Judge Harper was committing those crimes. Karen hesitated. Just for a second. But that second was long enough for everyone to notice. Well, I mean, I suspected something, she said weakly. The younger officer finished writing in his notebook. Mark Jensen quietly stepped back, clearly wishing he had never walked into this situation. The older officer continued. The issue here, he explained, is that accusing someone of corruption, especially a judge, is extremely serious. Karen crossed her arms again, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. I was just reporting suspicious behavior. The officer nodded. But your call specifically stated bribery and document forgery. Karen looked down. And those claims triggered a formal report. Karen's shoulders sank. What happens now? She asked quietly. The officer answered carefully. Right now, we submit the report exactly as it happened. Karen swallowed. And then it gets reviewed. By who? The officer glanced toward me briefly. Judicial Oversight and Internal Affairs. Karen's face turned pale again. Because she was finally beginning to understand something important. This wasn't just about embarrassing herself in front of the neighborhood. Her accusations had now entered an official system. A system that investigated claims about judges very seriously. Even when those claims came from someone who simply suspected something. Karen looked at Mark desperately. Tell them I was just trying to help the WA. Mark rubbed his face. Karen, this has nothing to do with the WA anymore. She looked back at the officers. So am I being arrested? The younger officer shook his head. Not today. Karen let out a shaky breath. But, the older officer added calmly, filing a false report can carry penalties depending on the review. Karen's relief faded immediately. So, what do I do now? The officer closed his notebook. For now, you go home. Karen didn't move, because even though the officers hadn't arrested her, she could feel the weight of what had just happened. Her accusations had triggered something bigger than she ever imagined. And once official investigations begin, they rarely end quietly. Karen slowly turned toward her house. But as she walked away, she didn't realize something else. The story wasn't over yet. Because the investigation she started was about to reveal something she definitely didn't want anyone discovering. For the next few days, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Karen stayed inside her house almost constantly. The woman who used to patrol the sidewalks with a clipboard, measuring grass height and photographing trash cans, had suddenly disappeared from public view. But the story she started hadn't disappeared. It had moved somewhere much more serious. 3 days after the police visit, I arrived home from court to find another vehicle parked outside Karen's house. Not a police cruiser this time. A county investigator's car. 2 officials were standing on her porch, speaking with her through the doorway. Karen looked pale, nervous, and far less confident than the woman who had proudly pointed at me in the street earlier that week. Word traveled quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, most of the residents already knew what had happened. The investigation triggered by Karen's accusations had uncovered something unexpected. And it had nothing to do with me. During the review of her police report, investigators began looking at Karen's history of complaints and filings within the HOA. What they discovered raised serious questions. Multiple reports she had submitted over the past year contained statements that were questionable. Some complaints included altered photos. Others included accusations against neighbors that had no evidence at all. But the most serious issue involved law enforcement notices. According to the investigation, Karen had been sending out warning letters to several residents claiming they owed WA fines. The problem, she wasn't authorized to issue those notices. And the letters used official-looking language that made them appear legally binding. In other words, Karen had accused someone else of forging legal authority while possibly doing something very similar herself. By the end of the week, the WA board held an emergency meeting. Mark Jensen personally visited several homes to explain the situation. Karen was immediately removed from all WA committees. The unauthorized notices were declared invalid. And the investigation into her actions was officially turned over to county officials. As for me, the situation returned to normal. I continued going to court every morning, reviewing case files at home in the evening, and enjoying the quiet neighborhood I had always appreciated. Karen, however, was never quite the same. She stopped attending HOA meetings entirely. The woman who once tried to control every rule in the neighborhood now avoided eye contact whenever she stepped outside. Because the day she tried to expose a criminal, she accidentally exposed herself instead.
All because she made one mistake. She believed accusations were stronger than truth. But as it turns out, when lies start investigation, the truth is usually what finishes them. If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.